a competition that can spill over to disaster. This is a negative sum game. As an economist, I'm always desperately trying to find the efficient outcome. So people who know the prisoner's dilemma game, the famous game, the so-called equilibrium or the Nash equilibrium of the prisoner's dilemma is not a zero-sum outcome, it's a negative sum. Cooperation by both sides is better, but everybody has the incentive to cheat. So you end up with a cheat-cheat equilibrium, or what they call the defect-defect equilibrium. But that's not zero sum, that's negative sum. It offends an economist. We're all for efficiency. In other words, you can make both sides better off by reaching the mutual accommodation. And then the endless question is, well, how do you enforce that when there's an incentive to cheat? And what game theory teaches us is several different things. One is that if you're in repeated play, it's more complicated than just one-off cheating. And so there is an incentive to stick by a treaty. Not perfect, but it's not zero either. And so the future casts a shadow over the decisions of the present. The nuclear arms treaties actually have worked, except when the US unilaterally walked out on them. That proves both John's point and my point. John's point is, well, the US walked out on them. My point is that the Soviets and the Russians actually obeyed them. And this is very important. When President John F. Kennedy was trying to convince the American people of the partial nuclear test ban treaty, he said, well, this is in Russia's Soviet incentive and our incentive to stick by it because it's mutually beneficial. It's a positive sum compared to a nuclear arms race. He convinced the Senate by an overwhelming majority, and the Soviets stuck by the partial nuclear test ban treaty. He also said something very important, that he was not looking for, the miracle age when conflicts go away. I think that we're in a nonstop struggle with the reality that John portrays. In other words, of course there's cheating. Of course no treaty will last forever. But let's stay alive the next 20 years. Let's do the best we can. Let's sign treaties, try to abide by them, use the reputation effects. Game theory has established that there are many, many ways to have cooperation in an iterated prisoner's dilemma. It's reciprocity, it's indirect reciprocity, as they call it, that you lose your reputation to others. It's collective punishment, which brings a higher level of governance above your head than the UN Security Council putting on sanctions and so on. None of this works all that well, I admit. But it's better to stay alive and try these things and make them work as best we can than to just say that we're in a war of all against all, almost as an inevitability, because I really don't believe that. And I think that the idea is, let's do it now. Things will change. Someone will violate this. Let's go back to the logic of positive sum games or negative sum possibilities and redo it if we have to in the future. So I don't deny the difficulties, but I also think that both the formal game theory, if you could say, and historical experience shows there are periods of peace that are actually constructed. And they're constructed in part on treaties and mutual agreements, and they last for a long time. And then they don't last. And then you have a big risk of war. I'm very worried that the logic that yes, it's going to happen, war is going to happen. I just hate the nuclear reality of it right now, which is that I do believe in this concept of the nuclear revolution, that something's really, truly, horrifically different now in our reality. We really have a nuclear sword of Damocles over our head, so we have to try even harder to get this right. Then the third point that John mentioned, which was number 2 in his counting, which is that we would have continued competition elsewhere. And I think a perfect case of that would be Chinese and US competition in Africa, for example. Everybody wants cobalt, everybody wants copper. Everybody wants the resources. Everybody wants the votes, perhaps in the UN, whatever. And so Africa is not in either America's or China's or Russia's or India's sphere of security. It's just far away. And so there will be competition there. Now, what would one say about that? I would say, yes, that's true. I would, of course, try to avoid it. My main logic on that case would be to go to the Africans themselves and say, get into that union because you're a lot safer in an African union of 55 countries than being picked apart by the major powers. But I think Africa is exactly the kind of playground of competition that John is talking about. It's real, it's true, but it's much less likely to devolve to nuclear war and much more likely to, it could even be local skirmishes or even wars or coups or other things, no doubt. But it is unlikely to be the trigger of a nuclear war because even literally there's more time in space. It's not in the other face. So bottom line for me is we do have mechanisms of cooperation that are imperfect but are real. We cooperate more than single period prisoner's dilemmas or hawk dove games in the jargon imply. We're better at that because we know how dangerous they are. Being negative sum means there's really an advantage to holding to a cooperative outcome. And we can use so-called trigger strategies, which are if you break this agreement, I'd break 10 agreements in the future, or other kinds of uh, means, treaties, literally, or uh, reputational costs to make a difference. And just to add one point on this, the West, the US and Europe thought, I believe, that when the Ukraine war escalated, Putin would be isolated worldwide. And they spoke as if, oh, the whole world knows this man's a tyrant. And of course, it didn't happen, a point that the three of us have been making constantly. President Putin is very well respected, thank you, in well over 100 countries in the world. Why? Because he's not seen to have violated norms the way that the West portrays him as violating the norms. If you go to a leader in Africa or to a leader in Asia, they say, why did the US provoke this war? They don't see this as the unprovoked war that the US claims it to be or that Europe claims it to be. Putin did not incur a high reputational cost from this war because, in my view, in substance, what he did was provoked, as John Mearsheimer explained to us all in 2014. And so, in my view, this is an example of reputation matters. But Putin didn't lose reputationally, only in the bubble of Western propaganda, not in the worldwide opinion, because it was seen to be a violation of a norm by the US. Why are they so aggressive? Why are they pushing NATO? Why are they trying to be in Ukraine? Why did they overthrow a government in February 2014? And on and on. And in that sense, it seems to me this idea that reputation can help to secure agreements, not forever, but better than just outright we're locked in struggle viewpoint is a real point and a constructive point, and we should use it constantly because we need to stumble forward generation to generation without blowing ourselves up. And I very much love President John F. Kennedy's peace speech of June 10, 1963. I wrote a book about it because I like it so much. And one thing he says I think is very important. He says, peace is a process, a way of solving problems. So it's not a grand solution. It's not the end of realism at all. But it is a process that we should use to our advantage, to our mutual advantage.
I have a number of points I want to make to Jeff and to you, Glenn. first of all, just on the United States and China competing in Africa, I actually think the real competition will come in the Middle East.
Mhm.
Because, as you know better than I do, Jeff, the Chinese economy depends very heavily on imported oil from the Gulf. And the Persian Gulf has long been an area of great strategic interest to the United States. But if you think about it, competition between the United States and China in the Gulf bleeds into competition in that sphere of security that you want to create in East Asia. Because if I'm the United States and I'm competing with the Chinese in the Middle East, I know they have a blue water navy that is coming out of East Asia, going through, say, Southeast Asia through the Straits of Malacca and heading, towards the Persian Gulf. So, what's going on in East Asia, especially Southeast Asia, has an impact on what's going on vis-a-vis the Chinese in the Middle East. So, you can see where a competition in the Middle East, which, as you correctly pointed out, is not naturally a sphere for either one of those great powers, can have an impact on how the United States thinks about interfering or not interfering in East Asia, especially in Southeast Asia. This is the point that I was making before. Just another quick point. Uh, you talk about there have been long periods of peace. I would not use the word peace, although I fully understand what you're saying, Jeff. My argument is that when you're dealing with great powers, you have constant security competition. Sometimes that security competition is more or less intense. There's no question about that. You're not at each other's throat every day. But the name of the game is to make sure that the security competition remains a security competition and doesn't turn into a hot war. I think
Yep.
all three of us are in total agreement on that point. And again, we live in a nuclear world, and the last thing we want is a real war. And the basic argument is that it's important to understand, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I'll say it, but to accept my logic because it's so powerful and you want to work around it. In other words, what I'm saying is you can't take my logic, my tragedy of great power politics logic off the table. It's just baked into the system. And you want to recognize that and you want to work around it. So that's the argument that I'm making. I'm not making the argument that we want to go out and strangle the Chinese tomorrow and we just got to do more to hammer the Russians. That's not my argument. My argument is understand how this world works, understand the tragic nature of international politics, and do everything you can to manage it.
But
Now,
John, if I may, I don't want to interrupt, but
no, go ahead.
in a way, that's what I'm trying to do, which is to say, okay, at least keep a distance because you're so prone to stumble into conflict. At least know, have the sense, don't go to Ukraine and Georgia with NATO for God's sake. Why don't Americans understand that? And we agree on that point, but I say it as a point of principle. Stay out of their neighborhood for heaven's sake. Exactly for your reason, which is it's so easy to stumble into crisis.
Well, my
And we're in
response,
it, actually.
to put it mildly, my
Yes.
response is not directed at you, but it's directed at those people who thought we could and can expand NATO to include Georgia and
Oh, okay.
Ukraine.
Yes.
They do not accept my logic.
I
They,
do.
I know, okay, but I'm just saying they don't. And if
Okay.
they, my argument all along has been if you understood basic balance of power logic, you would not try to extend NATO into Ukraine and into Georgia. Because in my rhetoric, that is clearly a well established sphere of influence for the Russians, and they will fight to the death to prevent you from turning Ukraine into a launching pad for missiles
Right.
that can hit Russia.
So
That's
we're in complete agreement on that. But the only point I'm trying to make to add a nuance is if we call it a sphere of security in Ukraine, not a sphere of influence, we free ourselves, I think, from a legitimate argument, but what about the Ukrainians? And my view is they have the right to trade with who they want, but they don't have the right to host whoever they want militarily. That's my point. Uh, and that's the difference.
Okay. Well, as I said, I think that getting mutual agreement
Yeah.
and making it stick is very difficult. I want to make another point, and I'm going to go to great lengths not to get into the weeds here, but prisoner's dilemma is fundamentally different than the logic that I lay out. And the reason is that prisoner's dilemma does not involve relative gains. In other words, it is not concerned about what I gain as a prisoner versus what you gain as a prisoner, Jeff. I only care about what Jeff does in the prisoner's dilemma in terms of whether it maximizes my utility. I get the best possible deal for myself. So I care about what Jeff does, so I get a good deal. What happens to Jeff in the end, I don't care about, right? Whether Jeff ends up more powerful than me or not, it doesn't matter in prisoner's dilemma. All I care about is my own utility, to put it in social science speak. My logic is fundamentally different. My logic is that I care greatly what happens to Jeff, how much power Jeff gains as a result of playing out the prisoner's dilemma versus how much John gets. Relative power matters greatly, or to put it in slightly different terms, relative gains underpins my realist logic, whereas absolute gains, right? You only care about your own gains in prisoner's dilemma. So I think that prisoner's dilemma is not analogous to what I'm talking about. Now, let me make two other very quick points. One is just on Germany. I actually think that we got the best solution. We basically cut it in half, and we had the Cold War. Your argument is no, that we should have had a neutral Germany. We should have let Germany reunify after the war, and it becomes neutral. It's largely disarmed, sort of like what we did after World War One.
Mhm. But
The
without
pro-
the punitive side.
okay, without the punitive side. But the problem is you cannot be certain what Germany will look like in 20 or 30 years. You cannot guarantee me that that unified Germany, even if it is neutral in 1945 or 46, whenever, will be neutral in 1996. And I don't want to take a chance. So I think we came up with the best solution. We just cut it into pieces. And by the way, this raises the question of what you would have done with Germany in 1918. Knowing what we now know, what would you do with Germany in 1918? It was an incredibly powerful state in 1918, right? In terms of latent power, wow. And what do you do? Do you treat it in a benevolent way, as Keynes advocated, and as you surely believe? Do you bring it back into the so-called community of nations? You've just fought a world war against this country. Uh, if you could have divided it in half in 1918 and kept it divided, you would have avoided World War II. So you want to understand that this inability of ours to figure out what the future looks like gives states very powerful incentives to behave in ruthless ways at the moment so that they stave off disaster down the road. My final point, I want to agree with you, and this is the whole business of geographical proximity and the idea of putting missiles in a place uh, like Ukraine, and even putting ABM systems in Eastern Europe. Those ABM systems, by the way, could have easily been used to launch offensive missiles
Yes.
against Russia, right? Look, in the Cold War in the 1980s, the Reagan administration was in power, and we now know, we knew it at the time, at least most of us did, that we were itching to develop a first strike capability against the Soviet Union. And given that they had a massive number of missiles, the way you did it was with a decapitation strategy. And I remember people used to say, well, we won't get all of the Soviet missiles, some will be left. And there will be, this was the phrase that was used at the time, a ragged retaliation. And the reason that we needed Star Wars was to deal with the ragged
Mm,
retaliation.
mhm.
But remember, we were talking about putting Pershings and ground launched cruise missiles, medium range missiles. This is what the Intermediate Range Ballistic Missile Treaty or Missile Treaty, the INF, was designed to eliminate. The Soviets were glad to have an INF treaty because they viewed those Pershings and Glickums in Western Europe as part of a decapitation strategy.
Mhm.
So you're absolutely right that the idea that we could take Ukraine and use it as a launching pad against Russia was a prescription for disaster. And I think any good realist, and this includes the three of us, understands that that was asking for big trouble. And needless to say, we got big trouble. And then, of course, what do? We doubled down. We let Ukraine launch attacks
Yes, exactly.
against Russia's strategic nuclear weapons. Just think about that. Not only that, to take it a step further, we allowed Ukraine to invade Mother Russia, right? So you can fully understand why, from a Russian point of view, this is categorically unacceptable for Ukraine or for Georgia to be in NATO, as you pointed out. And I think from your point of view, and from my point of view, and certainly from Glenn's point of view, this was a remarkably foolish move.
May I just mention one point, and then I hope we could do another show to discuss Germany in 1918 and Germany in 1945, because it would be absolutely phenomenal. But the point I would make is that your model of relative power is perfectly, of course, rigorous and logical, but it is still an equilibrium of a negative sum in the sense that think of each side playing hawk or dove, of course, in the traditional way. And because relative matters, both sides end up playing hawk. And that's the point in this in uncertain world. If the other side plays dove, great. And if the other side plays hawk, you better play hawk. And that's very much true in your sense, as it is in the prisoner's dilemma. And the point I'm making is that hawk, hawk is worse for both than dove, dove. The relativity is the same in both cases. One is an arms race or open war, in other words, costly waste of resources, either moderate or disastrous, and the other is peace based on a mutuality. And your realist position, fully uh, rigorous, is that the hawk hawk position, even more than in a prisoner's dilemma of the typical sort, is the equilibrium of that, because how could you dare play dove? And so getting to dove dove, you say, is so hard. And in an uncertain world and no higher authority and changing circumstances. And I'm saying, even in that situation, we can figure out how to make dove dove stick for a while, because Metternich or Bismarck did it for a while until Wilhelm II kicked Bismarck out, or the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Vietnamese did it for a few hundred years. Uh, we can figure out ways to just back off enough so that we're not maximally hawkish. And we agree on the specifics in Ukraine, for example, and I just want to generalize that in terms of clarification. It doesn't sacrifice Ukraine to say you can't join NATO, because you can trade with us and we're going to invest with you. And Russia's not going to be able to claim that it's their sphere of influence, but they are right to say, don't put your missiles there.
But let me just tell you what I think the fly in the ointment is. Let's assume that you and I are two states, right? And we're both satisfied with the status quo. The last thing we want to do is aggress against each other or anybody else. We like the status quo. Okay. And your point is that in that world, to behave as two doves is the smart thing to do. And it would be ridiculous for us to behave as hawk, because we're both satisfied with the
Right.
status quo. So let's be doves, right? My point is, I cannot be sure that you're a dove, and you can't be sure that I'm a dove. And even if you, Jeff, can be sure today that I'm a dove, you cannot be sure in a year or 2 years or 3 years that I will remain a dove, right? It's the intentions that are so tricky here. I can't be sure what your intentions are, and you can't be sure what my intentions are. So the safe thing to do is for me to assume that you're a hawk. And the safe thing for you to do is to assume that I'm a hawk. And what that ends up is creating a tragic situation
I know, but it's
where
not safe. That's the problem.
it
That's
is
the
not.
tragedy.
Yes, that's the tragedy. I'm not arguing that it's
I
safe.
know.
That's not the argument,
I know.
right? It's a terrible situation. But I would just point out to you, Jeff, in the Cold War, right? When if you're in the intelligence world and you were looking at the Soviet Union, this is in the Cold War, we actually got to the point where we could really assess Soviet capabilities very well. You can pretty much see everything that they had, overhead satellites and the like, right?
Yeah.
What we could never agree on, and we had huge debates that rage to this day, is whether or not the Soviet Union was a status quo power. As you describe it, I think your description, by the way, of what Soviet intentions were at the end of World War II is correct. The last thing they wanted was a world war with the United States
Yes.
after what had just happened to them. They had more than enough security at that point in time because they had effectively solved the German problem, again, as you were saying. But if you go back to what the Americans were thinking at the time, there was a huge dispute in this country. Lots of people thought like you and I do, but lots of people thought the opposite, that they were primed to conquer all of Europe. They wanted world domination. This is what communism is all about, and so forth and so on. So the point is, we couldn't tell what their intentions were. And the end result is we looked at their capabilities and we assumed worst case about their intentions.
Right.
And again, this is the tragedy.
But they should have taken our course. That's the point.
Well, we have to start to wrap this up. I just thought to finish on a positive note. I just like to comment why I think this sphere of security is a very well. I like it as an idea, and that's because in Europe, all our efforts to develop a pan-European security architecture that is based on the Helsinki Accords from 75 to the Charter of Paris for a New Europe in 1990 to the establishment of OSCE in 94, we always introduced two principles which were in conflict. The one was indivisible security, so one should not enhance security at the expense of the other. But the second is everyone has the right to pursue their own foreign policy. Now, this, to some extent, is contradictory because, let's say, Ukraine should have the freedom to join NATO if it wants to. However, then, of course, this breaches the principle of indivisible security. But, these two things, they can actually be harmonized. That is, if you have a sphere of security, essentially, this is the approach because then the indivisible security becomes a responsibility of the great powers. That is, no one is forcing NATO to roll into Ukraine. This is again, it's a responsibility of the great powers, and I think this is where NATO failed with its open door policy and NATO expansionism. It's almost like a law of nature. And what happened then is the Russia NATO disagreements to create a common Europe or conflict. It was transitioned into a Russia-Ukraine conflict instead because now the Russians could make a deal with NATO. Now they have to stop the Ukrainians, and I think yeah, for this reason we have war because NATO ignored indivisible security, and then Russia ignored the sovereign rights of Ukraine to do what it wants. And anyways, I think therefore all our ambitions to have this pan-European security architecture, it kind of misses one component. And I think the sphere of security can help to fill this in. But again, I also consider myself a very hardcore realist, but also with some idealistic inclinations. So I would like to hope that there's some opportunities to reform there. Anyways, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, just how grateful I am always to learn from both of you. And I hope we can come back and talk about some of these other issues because they're really fascinating. And the history is very important because it helps to inform very much our way of understanding the present.
Yeah, I agree with that completely, Jeff. And I would also note that if you think about the future of Europe and the fact that the American pacifier appears to be disappearing and that the European states are going to be on their own more than ever, the whole question of how that plays out is directly relevant to what we're talking about here today, and actually even has some relevance in terms of what happened with Germany in 1918 and after 1945. Just all sorts of big questions of an empirical nature or a historical nature floating around.